He came home from a 3-month business trip expecting his daughter's laughter. Instead, he found her begging for cookies in the rain. The mansion was dark, the fridge was empty, and the truth inside that house would shatter him because while he was building a fortune, his little girl was trying to survive alone. The afternoon sun burned over Mercer Island with a hard, colorless glare, turning every glass window into a blade of light. The mansions along the private ridge stood in perfect silence behind iron gates and trimmed hedges, their white stone facades too polished, too expensive, too cold, to suggest that anything inside them could ever decay. A black Escalade rolled slowly through the heat shimmer and stopped in front of Hart Manor, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Caius Vale Hart, 44, sat motionless behind the wheel for a moment, one hand still resting on the leather, his jaw tight from travel and sleepless flights. 3 months in Copenhagen and Stockholm had left him wrung out, but the thought that had carried him home was simple Isla. He had imagined her laughter spilling down the veranda, imagined her small body hurtling toward him, imagined the bright chaos of a child who still believed her father always came back. Instead, the gates were half open. The front garden had yellowed at the edges. The fountain was off. No music drifted from the house. No curtains moved. The estate looked abandoned in broad daylight, and that alone made something dark stir beneath his ribs. He stepped out into the heat. Dry leaves scraped faintly across the stone path. Somewhere in the distance a crow cried once and went quiet. Then another sound reached him, soft, uncertain, almost too small to register. A child's footsteps, a little tap of sandals against pavement. Caius turned. Across the street in front of the Barlow's house, a small girl stood clutching an empty plastic container in both hands. Her brown hair was tangled by wind. Her lavender dress hung loose on her thin frame. His breath stopped. He knew that dress. He had bought it in Sweden, and the little girl wearing it was his daughter. Caius did not move at first. He stood beside his SUV with the driver's door still open, watching from across the street, as if his body needed one more second to accept what his eyes were showing him. Isla looked impossibly small on the Barlow's front step, a 6-year-old child in a faded lavender dress, dusty at the hem, bare knees, smudged sandals worn down at the straps. She held the plastic container to her chest, like something precious, though it was empty. The front door opened wider. Graham Barlow, thick around the middle with a coffee mug in one hand and permanent irritation carved into his face, looked down at her as if she were something unpleasant he had found near his shoes. "You again?" he said. Isla swallowed. Her voice came out so soft, the hot air nearly erased it. "Please, sir. Just one cookie. Mommy hasn't eaten either." Barlow let out a dry, ugly laugh. "A rich man's daughter begging for scraps. That's embarrassing." Isla lowered her eyes but did not leave. Caius could see the effort it took for her to remain standing there. She was hungry, she was frightened, and still she was asking not only for herself. Barlow took a sip of coffee, then tipped the mug carelessly. Dark liquid splashed over the top step and scattered near Isla's feet. She flinched backward, hugging the container tighter. "Tell your father to buy you a bakery," he muttered. "Or maybe he's too busy buying Europe." Something inside Caius snapped without sound. He crossed the street in long, fast strides, every step heavier than the last. Barlow looked up too late. Isla turned at the movement, and for one stunned second, her eyes widened as if she didn't trust what she was seeing. Daddy Caius dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms. Only then did she break apart and sob. Rain began just as Caius carried Isla back across the street, a sharp, sudden curtain falling from a sky that had been white with heat only minutes before. She clung to him with both arms around his neck, her body trembling in small, exhausted waves, and he held her so tightly it was almost desperate. Her cheek was damp against his shoulder, her breath ragged, her plastic container crushed between them. Hart Manor loomed ahead, all stone and glass and dead silence. Inside, the smell hit him first. Spoiled milk, stale alcohol, mold, rotting takeout. A damp, sour heaviness that clung to the air like something alive. Caius stopped in the foyer, every muscle in his body tightening as he looked around. The marble floors were sticky beneath his shoes. Dry leaves had blown in through the half-open door. A vase lay shattered in the hall, the flowers inside it shriveled to brown strings. Somewhere deeper in the house, a television flickered soundlessly, throwing weak blue light against a wall stained with watermarks. He set Isla gently on the sofa in the living room. Broken toys, beer cans, wrinkled newspapers, and empty bottles crowded every surface. She curled instantly into the corner cushion and gripped the sleeve of his coat, her eyes fixed not on him but on the dark hallway. "Stay here, sweetheart," he said softly. She nodded, though her face had gone pale. In the kitchen, the refrigerator held almost nothing: one bloated carton of milk, 2 slices of moldy bread, and a liquor receipt taped to the shelf with a debt note folded beneath it. Caius shut the door slowly, horror rising cold through his chest. Then he noticed the closet in the hallway standing slightly open. Inside was a tiny pillow, a threadbare blanket, a one-eyed stuffed rabbit, and an empty cracker box. When he turned back, Isla's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's quieter in there," she said, "when Mommy breaks things." Caius followed the weak yellow light spilling from the kitchen and found Rhiannon slumped over the table like the last survivor of a shipwreck no one had come to search for. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face. One hand still gripped the neck of a half-empty wine bottle. The other lay limp beside a pile of overdue bills stained with moisture and rings from old glasses. For one terrible moment, he thought she might be dead. Then she moved. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her mascara had bled into shadows beneath her eyes, and her cheeks had hollowed in ways that made her look older than 35. She blinked at him in confusion, then tried to smile. "Caius," she murmured. "You're back early." He stood there in the doorway, rainwater dripping from his coat, unable to fit this ruined woman to the memory of the wife he had left behind 3 months ago. What happened here? Rhiannon looked around as if seeing the destruction for the first time. "It's just a little trouble. A little trouble." His voice stayed low, but the restraint inside it was more frightening than shouting. "Our daughter was begging for food across the street." At that, something ugly flashed across her face. Shame, defensiveness, anger. "You don't know what it's been like here. I know what I saw." She pushed herself upright with unsteady arms. "You disappeared into meetings, flights, investors' dinners. I was alone in this mausoleum with bills, pressure, silence, with Isla," he cut in. Rhiannon laughed once, harsh and brittle, then wiped at tears that kept falling anyway. "Don't stand there and act pure. You left me to drown." From the living room, a small sound drifted in, the light clatter of a broken doll being set carefully back down. That sound ended whatever was left of the illusion. Rhiannon saw it in his face before he spoke. "I'm taking her," he said. Rhiannon straightened so suddenly the chair legs scraped hard against the tile. "No." Her voice cracked, then rose. "You are not taking my daughter anywhere." Caius did not argue. He turned and walked back into the living room, where Isla sat exactly where he had left her, small and still among the wreckage, like a child, trying not to take up too much space in her own home. The sight nearly shattered him again. He bent, lifted her into his arms, and turned toward the foyer. Behind him, glass exploded. Rhiannon had hurled the wine bottle against the wall. Red liquid streaked down pale paint like blood in the lightning. She stumbled after them, barefoot, trembling, half furious and half broken. "You can't just walk in and judge me after vanishing for 3 months." Caius stopped at the door, but did not look back. Rain hammered the front steps, now cold and relentless. "I believed you when you told me she was safe." Rhiannon made a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. "I was trying to survive." In his arms, Isla pressed closer, her face buried against his shoulder. Then she whispered the words that ended every debate. "Daddy, please don't leave me here tonight." He stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through his shirt in seconds, but he barely felt it. He carried her across the dark lawn through the gate to the SUV, with the careful urgency of a man carrying the only thing left worth saving. Behind him, the house glowed dimly through sheets of water, its broken windows full of unstable light. Inside the car, Isla shook beneath his jacket. As he started the engine, guilt rose like floodwater in his chest. He had thought he was building security, building comfort, building a future large enough to shelter them all. Instead, while he built a future, his daughter had been surviving the present. By the time Caius pulled into the harbor diner on the edge of Seattle, the rain had thinned to a silver mist, but Isla was still shivering in the back seat under his coat. The diner's neon sign buzzed weakly above the door, casting red and blue light across puddles in the parking lot. Inside, the air smelled of coffee butter and fried onions, simple, ordinary things that suddenly felt more luxurious than anything in Hart Manor. A waitress with tired eyes took one look at them and said nothing about the soaked suit, the child in borrowed warmth, or the way Caius's hands would not stop shaking. He ordered too much without meaning to chicken soup, grilled cheese, fruit, warm milk, toast with jam. It was not hunger guiding him now. It was horror. It was the useless instinct to repair months of damage with one hot meal. Isla sat across from him, her wet hair tucked behind her ears, both hands wrapped around the milk glass as if it were heat from another world. She ate carefully, almost apologetically, taking tiny bites and pausing between them like a child who no longer trusted food to remain hers. Caius watched every swallow. After a while, she spoke without looking up. "Mr. Barlow said he wasn't giving me leftovers anymore." His throat tightened. She dipped her spoon into the soup again. "I asked before. Sometimes at his house, sometimes at Mrs. Hale's, sometimes nowhere. Why didn't Mommy feed you?" Isla's lashes lowered. "Mommy slept a lot," a pause, "and sometimes cried." Then, in the same soft voice, she added the sentence that broke him open completely. "I wanted cookies for Mommy, too." The waitress returned with a slice of apple pie and set it down between them. "Kitchen made an extra," she said, though they all knew that was a kindness, not a mistake. Caius looked at his daughter and understood the child had been starving and still she had been loving. The Fairmont hotel room was quiet in the way only expensive places could be, thick carpets swallowing sound, warm yellow lights glowing softly against polished wood. For Isla, it must have felt like another world. For Caius, it felt like a confession chamber. Steam filled the bathroom as he adjusted the water in the tub, testing it carefully with his wrist, the way he vaguely remembered parents doing. Isla stood beside him in borrowed pajamas from the hotel gift shop, her small shoulders stiff as if she expected something to break at any moment. "It's just warm water," he told her gently. "Nothing scary." She nodded. While he washed the rain from her tangled hair, she watched the fog gather across the mirror with wide, silent eyes. When he brushed through the knots, she winced once but didn't complain. When she finally curled beneath the hotel blanket, her body relaxed in slow degrees like a child who had been holding tension for far too long. Caius waited until her breathing deepened before opening his laptop. The screen's glow painted his face in pale light as he searched one name, Gideon March, family law attorney, Seattle. The call connected after 3 rings. "I need to file for divorce," Caius said quietly, "and emergency custody of my daughter." Gideon asked one question. "Do you have proof?" Caius looked across the room at Isla sleeping, her thin hand curled around the blanket. "Yes," he answered. "My daughter is the proof." When he finished sending the photographs of the ruined house, he sat in silence while rain slid down the window like silver threads. A moment later, Isla stirred in her sleep. "Don't leave me outside again." Caius crossed the room instantly and placed his hand over hers. "I won't," he whispered. I promise. The phone rang just after midnight. Caius already knew who it would be before the screen lit up. Rhiannon. For several seconds he stared at the name while rain whispered against the glass behind him. Then he answered. Her voice was hoarse, like someone who had been crying and drinking at the same time. Caius, are you still awake? He didn't answer immediately. What do you want, Rhiannon? A shaky breath filled the silence between them. I didn't think you'd take her. She was begging for food. The words landed hard. On the other end, Rhiannon began speaking quickly, too quickly, like someone trying to outrun their own guilt. You don't understand what it's been like here. The house felt empty. The bills kept coming. You were gone all the time and I was alone. You weren't alone, he interrupted quietly. You had our daughter. Rhiannon started crying openly now. I was drowning, Caius. I needed help. And Isla needed a mother. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was rain tapping against the window. Then Rhiannon whispered something that almost broke him. I still love you. Caius closed his eyes. Love doesn't let a 6-year-old beg for cookies in the rain. The line went silent. When he ended the call, the glass of water in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor. He knelt automatically, picking up the broken pieces, while thin lines of blood opened across his fingers. Just as he finished, his phone vibrated again. A message from an unknown number. Don't judge me before you hear me out. Caius stared at the screen. He already knew who sent it. The next morning, Caius drove back to Mercer Island. He didn't go straight to Hart Manor. Instead, he stopped at the small cedar house at the far end of the street. The woman who opened the door looked as though she had been expecting him. Mr. Hart, she said softly. I wondered when you'd come. Her name was Miriam Hale, 67, thin and steady-eyed. She led him into a kitchen that smelled faintly of peppermint tea and fresh bread. On the table sat an old shoebox wrapped with faded rubber bands. I think you should see this. Inside were photographs. Dozens. Caius lifted the first one. Isla sitting on the porch steps, hugging her stomach. The second showed her curled beneath the small awning beside the garage while rain streaked across the pavement. The third made his hands shake. Isla asleep on the ground beside the garden wall. I took them over the past 3 months, Miriam said quietly. I didn't know how to reach you. He kept turning the pictures, each one carved deeper than the last. I wanted to call the police, she continued, but your daughter begged me not to. She said her mother would get angry. Caius closed his eyes briefly. There's more, Miriam added. She handed him a small recorder. When the windows were open, I heard things. Caius pressed play. Rhiannon's voice slurred through the speaker. That kid eats too much. Sometimes I wish he had taken her with him. The sound in the room died. Caius turned the recorder off. Across the street, Hart Manor stood silent beneath gray clouds. His daughter had lived there. Alone, Caius left Miriam Hale's small house with the shoebox clutched tightly in his hands, the photographs inside heavier than any legal file he had ever carried. The sky over Mercer Island had turned dull gray clouds gathering low above the pine trees, as if the whole neighborhood were holding its breath. Across the street, Hart Manor stood exactly as he had left it the night before. Silent shuttered its once perfect lawn, scattered with rain-drenched leaves. For years, it had been a symbol of success, the kind of place investors admired and guests envied. Now it looked hollow, like a stage after the audience had gone home. Caius walked slowly to his SUV and placed the shoebox on the passenger seat. His hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment, but he didn't start the engine yet. Instead, he looked through the windshield at the house where his daughter had been afraid to sleep. 3 months. 3 months of photographs. 3 months of begging for food. 3 months of nights he had spent shaking hands with investors, while his child hid in a closet to escape the sound of breaking glass. The realization felt like ice sliding into his lungs. Finally, he started the car and drove away from the street. Rain began again, soft at first, misting the windshield. Halfway down the road, he glanced into the rearview mirror and saw it. A silver sedan parked beneath a cluster of trees. Its lights were off. For a moment, he thought nothing of it. Then the car's headlights flickered once briefly before going dark again. Someone was inside. Caius slowed slightly, trying to see through the rain-blurred mirror, but the driver lowered their head out of view. The car didn't move. It simply sat there, half hidden by branches, watching. He drove on. By the time he reached downtown Seattle, the rain had thickened into a steady drizzle that coated the city streets in dull reflections. The Fairmont Hotel lobby glowed warmly when he stepped inside, a comforting contrast to the storm outside. Isla was sitting on the sofa beside Celeste Rowan, stacking wooden blocks into a crooked tower. The moment she saw him, her face lit up. "Daddy." She ran across the marble floor and wrapped her arms around his legs. Caius lifted her instantly, pressing his face briefly into her damp hair. The simple act of holding her steadied the chaos in his chest. Behind them, Celeste noticed the shoebox in his hand. "Did you find something?" Caius nodded once. "Yes," he said quietly. "And it's worse than I thought." That night, the rain came down harder than before, hammering against the tall windows of the hotel like handfuls of thrown gravel. From the outside, the Fairmont looked calm and elegant, its golden lights reflecting across the wet streets. Inside Caius's suite, however, the atmosphere felt tight with unease. Isla had fallen asleep early, curled under a thick white blanket with a stuffed bear Celeste had bought her that afternoon. Caius sat at the small desk near the window, reviewing the photographs from Miriam Hale's shoebox, while his laptop glowed softly in the dark. Each image felt like a blade. He forced himself to study everyone. He needed to remember exactly what his daughter had endured. A sudden sound in the hallway broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Caius stiffened. The footsteps stopped outside the door. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then came a faint metallic click, the sound of someone touching the handle. His heart slammed hard once against his ribs. Before he could reach the door, a voice slipped through the thin crack beneath it. "Isla, sweetheart Rhiannon." The whisper sounded fragile and desperate, but it carried the unmistakable tremor of someone who had already lost control. Isla woke instantly. Her small body jerked upright in the bed, eyes wide with fear. She stared toward the door, as if the voice itself had entered the room. "Mommy," she whispered. The handle moved again. "Come with me, baby," Rhiannon murmured through the door. "Daddy's trying to take you away from me." Isla slid backward across the bed, shaking. Then she looked at Caius. "Daddy, please don't let the rain take me again." The words hit him harder than anything he had heard in the courtroom of his own mind that day. Caius crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled Isla into his arms. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You're safe." With his free hand, he called hotel security. By the time guards reached the hallway, Rhiannon had already vanished, but the security camera footage later showed her clearly entering through a service corridor soaked in rain, wearing a gray coat, and walking straight toward his door. Watching, waiting, and proving beyond doubt that the situation was far from over. Caius barely slept. He spent the night sitting beside Isla's bed, one arm resting across the blanket, while the other held his phone loosely in his lap. The rain continued outside the windows, sometimes soft, sometimes hammering against the glass with sudden bursts of wind. Every small sound in the hallway made him look up. At dawn, the storm eased into a gray mist that hung low over downtown Seattle. The quiet felt almost peaceful until the fire alarm exploded through the building. The shrill siren shattered the silence like a gunshot. Isla jerked awake instantly, panic flashing across her face. "It's okay," Caius said quickly, pulling her close. "It's just an alarm." But the shouting in the hallway told a different story. Someone pounded past the door. Another voice yelled, "Call security!" Caius walked cautiously to the window and looked down into the hotel lobby 4 floors below. His stomach dropped. Rhiannon stood in the center of the marble floor, drenched from head to toe, screaming. "You can't take her from me," she cried, her voice echoing through the towering lobby ceiling. "She's my daughter." 2 security guards tried to restrain her, but she struggled wildly, knocking a small table sideways as she fought against their grip. Hotel guests watched in stunned silence while the receptionist frantically called the police. Caius Rhiannon shouted again, her voice cracking with desperation. "You can't hide her from me." Isla stepped beside him at the window. For a split second, she saw everything. "Daddy," she whispered. "Mommy's crying." Caius turned her away from the glass immediately. "It's all right," he said softly, though his heart was pounding hard enough to shake his chest. Minutes later, police arrived. Rhiannon continued screaming even as officers escorted her out of the lobby and into the rain. Cameras from early reporters already flashed outside the entrance, turning the moment into spectacle. Caius didn't wait. Using the service elevator, he carried Isla down to the underground parking garage where Gideon March was already waiting beside a black sedan. "Time to go," Gideon said calmly. Caius placed Isla in the back seat and closed the door gently. As the car pulled away from the hotel, Isla watched the rain slide down the window. "Why is Mommy so angry?" she asked. Caius gripped the steering wheel tightly. After a long silence, he answered the only way he could, "Because sometimes people get lost, even when they love you." The offices of Gideon March overlooked Elliott Bay, but the view of gray water and distant ferries meant nothing to Caius that afternoon. His attention was fixed entirely on the long oak conference table where the evidence of the last 3 months lay spread out in neat, ruthless rows. Photographs, receipts, audio transcripts, security footage, stills. Gideon worked with quiet precision, placing each document into labeled folders while his assistant organized them chronologically. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just methodical clarity, the kind that wins courtrooms. This, Gideon said, tapping the photograph of Isla asleep beneath the garden awning, establishes a pattern. He slid the next one forward. Isla crouched beside the wall with her knees pulled to her chest. Neglect. Another image. The empty refrigerator. Environmental evidence. Caius watched in silence, his hands clasped tightly together. For years, he had been known as a man who could dismantle billion-dollar deals in minutes. Now he sat powerless while his own life was dissected like a case study. Gideon continued. The recordings from Miriam Hale strengthen the timeline. Her testimony will show consistent observation over 3 months. He paused, glancing briefly at Caius. And the hotel security footage last night proves unauthorized contact. Caius nodded once. Across the room, Celeste Rowan sat quietly with Isla in the corner lounge area, helping her color in a book of animals. The little girl hummed softly while filling a tiger with bright orange crayon. The sound felt painfully innocent. Gideon handed Caius a new document. A preliminary child psychology evaluation. Caius hesitated before reading it. The report was clinical, precise, and devastating. Heightened anxiety responses. Food insecurity behavior, sleep disruption, fear of loud noises resembling breaking glass, avoidance when discussing maternal contact. A single line near the bottom made his chest tighten. Child expresses strongest sense of safety in presence of father. Caius set the paper down slowly. "I should have seen it sooner," he said quietly. Gideon did not offer comfort. Instead, he replied with calm honesty. "Regret won't change what happened, but it can change what happens next." He closed the final folder and stacked the documents neatly. The emergency custody hearing is tomorrow morning. Across the room, Isla finished her drawing and ran over. Daddy, look. She held up a picture of two stick figures standing beside a small house with a bright yellow dog. Caius smiled faintly. That's beautiful. What's the dog's name? Gideon asked gently. Isla thought for a moment. Sunny. The drawing felt simple, but to Caius it looked like a map. A map of the life he had to build now, and tomorrow morning a judge would decide if he could. That evening, the hotel suite felt strangely calm, as if the storm outside had moved somewhere deeper inside the walls. Isla sat cross-legged on the bed, carefully brushing the fur of her stuffed bear, while Caius stood by the window, watching the mist drift across downtown Seattle. The city lights blurred softly through the rain. For the first time in days, there were no messages, no silver sedan, no voices in the hallway. But the quiet did not bring peace. It brought thinking. Caius had spent years traveling through boardrooms where every problem had a strategy, every risk a contingency plan. This situation was different. You couldn't negotiate with fear in a child's heart. You couldn't restructure trauma like a financial portfolio. Behind him, Isla spoke. Daddy, he turned immediately. Yes, sweetheart. She looked down at the bear in her hands before asking the question in a voice so small it almost disappeared. Are we going somewhere Mommy can't find me if she's scary again? Caius felt the words like a slow knife. He walked over and knelt beside the bed so they were eye level. Yes, he said gently. Her eyes searched his face with surprising seriousness. Promise, I promise. Isla studied him for another moment before nodding. Children had a strange ability to sense truth in adults. She seemed satisfied. She lay down beneath the blanket, but just before closing her eyes, she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his shirt. Don't stay at the window too long tonight. Caius froze. Why? She shrugged sleepily. You look like you're waiting for something bad. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The realization struck him harder than anything the lawyer had said that afternoon. She had been watching him watch for danger, even now, even here. He smoothed her hair gently until she drifted off to sleep. Hours later, when the room was completely quiet, Caius finally returned to the window. The rain had slowed. Streetlights cast dull reflections across the wet pavement below, and beneath one of those lights, a silver car. Parked at the far end of the block, its windows dark, its engine off. Caius closed the curtain slowly. The hearing tomorrow was no longer just about custody, it was about safety. The morning of the hearing arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Outside the King County Courthouse, a thin crowd of reporters had already gathered along the steps, their cameras and microphones angled toward the entrance like metal flowers waiting to bloom. News vans lined the curb, headlines scrolled across mobile screens. Tech investor seeks emergency custody amid family scandal. Caius stepped out of the car and ignored them all. His focus was on Isla. She stood beside him in a small navy coat Celeste had bought her the day before, her hand wrapped tightly around two of his fingers. The courthouse felt enormous from her height. Towering stone columns, tall doors, strangers moving quickly past. He crouched down. You remember what we talked about? She nodded. I stay with the nice lady. That's right. A child psychologist from the court approached with a gentle smile and led Isla toward a quiet waiting room designed for minors. Before leaving, Isla turned and looked back at him. You'll win, won't you? Caius hesitated. He could not promise victory, so he told the truth. I'm going to tell the judge exactly what happened. She seemed satisfied with that. Inside the courtroom, the air felt colder than outside. Light streamed through the high windows, illuminating rows of polished wood benches. Gideon March stood beside the defense table reviewing the thick case file one last time. Across the room sat Rhiannon, She looked very different from the woman who had staggered through Hart Manor days earlier. Her hair was neatly tied back. Her dress was simple and pale. No alcohol haze clouded her eyes now. But the exhaustion remained. She glanced at Caius briefly. Neither of them spoke. A court officer called the room to order. Moments later, Judge Evelyn Mercer entered her calm presence, silencing even the reporters in the back row. The hearing began. Gideon rose first. He placed the thick file on the table before the judge and spoke with quiet clarity. "Your Honor, my client is not here to attack the mother of his child. He is here to protect the child herself." Then he pressed a button on the presentation screen. The first photograph appeared. Isla sitting alone on the front steps of Hart Manor. The courtroom fell completely silent. The truth had finally entered the room. The photograph on the courtroom screen showed a 6-year-old girl sitting alone on the front steps of Hart Manor. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Her head was lowered. Even without sound, the image carried something unbearable. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Gideon March stood calmly beside the projection screen, one hand resting lightly on the table as if he were presenting ordinary financial evidence instead of dismantling a family in front of strangers. "This photograph," he said evenly, "was taken by neighbor Miriam Hale on May 12th at approximately 8:40 p.m. The image changed. Now Isla was curled beneath the garage awning, rain streaking across the pavement beside her. May 23rd. Gideon continued. Temperature 48 degrees, another click. The next photograph showed Isla crouched beside the garden wall, hugging her stomach. June 1st. Then another. The empty refrigerator. Then another. The closet bed. The courtroom had grown so quiet that even the small sound of the projector fan seemed loud. Across the room, Rhiannon's lawyer shifted uneasily in his chair. "Your Honor," Gideon said calmly, "these photographs demonstrate a consistent pattern of neglect over a 3-month period." He stepped aside. However, the visual evidence alone does not tell the entire story. He pressed another button. A small audio recording filled the courtroom. At first, there was only static. Then Rhiannon's voice emerged thick with alcohol, careless and slurred. "That kid eats too much. Sometimes I wish he had taken her with him." The sentence hung in the air like poison. Someone in the gallery gasped. Rhiannon's head dropped instantly, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if the wood were the only thing keeping her upright. Her attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, the defense would like to clarify that this recording was taken during a period of severe emotional distress and alcohol dependency." Judge Mercer raised a hand. "You may respond in due course, Counselor." Gideon resumed speaking. "We also submit the testimony of Miriam Hale, who documented the child's condition over 3 months." The elderly woman stepped forward and took the witness stand. Her voice was steady. "I saw the girl ask for crackers more than once," she said quietly. "I saw her sleeping outside the house on 2 occasions. I heard shouting and breaking glass late at night." She glanced briefly toward Rhiannon. "I wanted to call the police, but the child begged me not to." The courtroom absorbed the words in silence. When Miriam finished, Gideon turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "this child did not simply lose comfort." He paused. "She lost the right to feel safe in her own home." For several seconds, no one moved. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Across the courtroom, Caius sat completely still. But his eyes had hardened. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was no longer confined to his memory. It had entered the record. The courtroom remained quiet even after Miriam Hale stepped down from the witness stand. Judge Mercer made a few notes in the file before looking toward the next witness. "The court will now hear from the child psychologist." A woman with short brown hair and thin glasses stood and approached the stand. She introduced herself as Dr. Alana Pierce, a licensed child trauma specialist appointed by the court the previous afternoon. Her voice carried the calm neutrality of someone accustomed to explaining painful truths. "I conducted an observational assessment of the minor child yesterday," she said. Rhiannon's attorney leaned forward slightly. "And what were your findings?" Dr. Pierce folded her hands. "The child demonstrates several indicators consistent with prolonged environmental stress." She listed them one by one. Sleep disturbances, heightened startle responses, food insecurity behaviors, fear responses connected to loud sounds resembling broken glass. Each statement landed like another weight placed onto the scale in front of the judge. Dr. Pierce continued. When discussing her home environment, the child displayed significant anxiety when referencing her mother. Rhiannon's shoulders trembled. The psychologist turned one page in her notes. However, she added carefully, the child demonstrated a strong sense of emotional safety when discussing her father. Judge Mercer looked up. "Did the child express a preference regarding living arrangements?" "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom grew so still it felt almost suspended. Dr. Pierce glanced at her notes again. When asked where she felt safest, the child responded. She paused briefly. "With Daddy." The words alone were powerful, but Dr. Pierce continued, and when I asked why she answered. The psychologist looked up from the page. "Because Daddy doesn't forget I'm small." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the reporters in the back row stopped typing. Rhiannon bowed forward over the table, her shoulders shaking as quiet sobs escaped her. Caius felt something twist painfully in his chest. He had come to court expecting anger. Instead, he was being handed forgiveness from a child who had every reason to feel abandoned. Judge Mercer allowed the silence to settle before speaking. "Mr. Hart," she said calmly, "would you like to address the court?" Caius rose slowly. For years he had spoken confidently in boardrooms filled with billion-dollar negotiations. But this was different. He looked toward the judge, then briefly toward the photograph of Isla displayed on the screen. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I am not blameless in this situation." The admission startled several people in the room. I believed that providing a comfortable life was enough. I believed success and security could replace time. His voice grew heavier. While I was building a future for my family, my daughter was surviving the present. He paused. The courtroom listened. I cannot undo the damage that happened while I was gone. Then his voice hardened with quiet determination. But I will spend the rest of my life making sure she never has to stand alone in the rain again. No one spoke after that. Judge Mercer nodded once. The court will recess for 10 minutes. The gavel struck, and the room slowly began to breathe again. When the courtroom session resumed 10 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed. The earlier tension had been replaced by something heavier, something final. Judge Mercer reviewed the documents in front of her carefully before lifting her eyes toward the two tables. "Mr. Hart," she began, "Miss Hart." Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of cases, yet the weight of this one was unmistakable. "The court has reviewed the submitted evidence, the witness testimony, and the psychological evaluation." Rhiannon sat rigidly in her chair, hands clasped tightly together. Caius remained still. Judge Mercer continued. "The evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of neglect within the home environment during the past 3 months." She glanced briefly at the photographs displayed on the courtroom monitor. A child should never have to beg for food while living in a household with substantial financial resources. The sentence echoed quietly across the room. Then she delivered the ruling. Effective immediately, the court grants temporary primary custody of the minor child Isla Hart to her father, Caius Vale Hart. The words felt almost unreal, but the judge had not finished. A temporary protection order will also be issued restricting unsupervised contact from the mother Rhiannon Hart until further evaluation and treatment compliance can be verified. The gavel struck once. The sound carried through the courtroom like a closing door. Rhiannon broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. She simply collapsed forward onto the table, her shoulders shaking, as tears finally overwhelmed the fragile control she had held since entering the room. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered through sobs. Her attorney placed a hand gently on her arm but said nothing. Across the room, Caius remained where he stood. Part of him wanted to walk over. Part of him remembered the photographs. Judge Mercer spoke again, her voice slightly softer. "This ruling is temporary pending further review." She looked toward Rhiannon. "Miss Hart, you will be required to enter a monitored treatment program. If progress is demonstrated, the court may reconsider supervised visitation." Rhiannon nodded weakly, unable to lift her head. The hearing ended soon after. Outside the courthouse, the sky had opened again into steady rain. Reporters gathered near the steps, cameras flashing, as Caius guided Isla carefully into the car, waiting at the curb. She climbed into the back seat and watched raindrops slide down the window. "Daddy," she said quietly. "Yes." She looked out through the wet glass toward the courthouse steps, where Rhiannon stood alone in the rain. "Mommy's still there." Caius followed her gaze for a moment. Rhiannon had not moved. She simply stood on the steps as the rain soaked through her pale dress. Finally, he turned the key in the ignition. "Look forward, sweetheart," he said gently. The car pulled away. Behind them, the courthouse slowly disappeared through the rain. But for the first time since the nightmare began, Isla was safe. The cottage stood quietly at the edge of Snoqualmie Valley, surrounded by tall cedar trees and a narrow stream that whispered over smooth stones day and night. Compared to Hart Manor, it was modest weathered wood siding a small porch, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen where morning sunlight spilled across the floor. But for Caius and Isla, it felt like a sanctuary. There were no gates, no marble hallways, no rooms echoing with silence. Just quiet. The first morning they woke there, Isla stood barefoot on the porch, watching mist drift through the trees. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, clean in a way the city never was. Caius handed her a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. Inside was a golden puppy with floppy ears and an endlessly wagging tail. Isla gasped with pure joy. "What's his name?" Caius asked. She thought for a moment before answering. "Sonny." The days that followed slowly settled into a new rhythm. Caius drove her to the small elementary school nearby each morning, something he had never done before in her life. In the afternoons, he worked from a laptop at the kitchen table while Isla colored pictures or played outside with Sonny in the grass. Sometimes they made pancakes together. Sometimes they watched old cartoons. Sometimes they simply sat on the porch listening to the creek. For the first time in months, Isla laughed freely, but the past did not disappear easily. One windy night, Caius stepped outside to collect laundry from the porch line. As he reached the gate at the end of the yard, his breath caught. A gray coat hung over the wooden fence. Rainwater dripped slowly from the sleeves. The scent of Rhiannon's perfume lingered faintly in the damp air. Caius removed the coat carefully and carried it inside. The next morning, Isla ran toward the gate with Sonny barking beside her. "Daddy," she called excitedly. Someone left a present. She held up a small pink candy box tied with ribbon. Caius opened it. Inside was a handwritten card. "Mommy is still here." His stomach tightened. Somewhere beyond the quiet cedar trees, someone was watching. Because of the protection order violation, the court moved the final hearing forward. 3 weeks later, Caius stood once again inside the King County Courthouse, but this time the atmosphere felt different, quieter, more final. Noel Hart had arrived from Portland to support him, sitting quietly in the second row, while Isla waited in the child consultation room with the court psychologist. Across the courtroom, Rhiannon looked thinner. There was no makeup, no anger, only exhaustion. Judge Mercer reviewed the updated case file before speaking. The court acknowledges the defendant has entered voluntary treatment. Rhiannon nodded faintly. But the court must prioritize the safety and emotional stability of the child. Gideon presented the final evidence: the coat left at the cottage, the candy box, the security footage showing a silver sedan parked near the property. When it was Rhiannon's turn to speak, she stood slowly. Her hands trembled slightly. "I know I made terrible mistakes," she said quietly. "I was lost. I hurt my daughter, even though I love her." Her voice cracked. "I don't want her to grow up afraid of me anymore." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Judge Mercer delivered the ruling. Primary custody of Isla Hart is granted permanently to her father, Caius Vale Hart. Rhiannon closed her eyes. However, the judge continued, the court will permit supervised visitation after 6 months of verified treatment and stability. The gavel struck. The decision was final. Outside the courthouse, light rain fell across the steps. Rhiannon approached Caius slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not teaching her to hate me." Caius met her eyes. "We both made mistakes." He paused. "I just hope she doesn't keep paying for them." Rhiannon nodded once before turning and walking away into the rain. 1 month later, the cedar cottage felt alive. Morning sunlight warmed the wooden floors while Sunny barked excitedly in the yard, chasing butterflies through the tall grass. Isla ran after him barefoot, her laughter echoing across the quiet valley. Caius stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee, watching through the window. For years he had believed success meant movement flights, meetings, contracts, endless travel across oceans. Now success looked very different. It looked like pancakes on a Saturday morning. It looked like a child laughing in the grass. It looked like staying. Later that afternoon, clouds gathered over the mountains, and rain began to fall again, soft at first, then steady. Caius instinctively glanced toward the porch. For months, rain had been the sound of fear in his daughter's life, but Isla ran outside before he could stop her. She lifted her face toward the sky, letting the cool drops land on her cheeks. "Look, Daddy," she called happily. Caius stepped onto the porch, raincoat in hand. "You'll get soaked." She turned toward him with a bright smile. "It's okay." He hesitated. Why, Isla shrugged lightly. "Rain isn't scary when you stay." The words hit him gently but deeply. Caius walked out into the rain and knelt beside her. Together they watched the drops ripple across the grass, while Sunny splashed happily through the puddles. That night, after Isla fell asleep, Caius found her small notebook open on the desk beside her bed. Inside, she had written one simple sentence in careful, uneven letters. "It rained today. But Daddy held my hand." So the rain sounded like music. Caius closed the notebook slowly. Outside the cottage, rain continued falling softly across the valley. But inside, the storm was finally over. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next